The most dangerous betrayal is never the one you see coming. It is the one standing close enough to shake your hand every day. The rain had been falling over Chicago for nearly 3 hours when Danielle Brooks noticed something that made her stop in the middle of polishing a crystal serving tray. The grand ballroom of the Moretti estate was alive with activity. Staff members moved between tables. Security personnel checked entrances. Drivers prepared vehicles outside. Everything appeared normal. Yet Danielle had learned long ago that appearances were often the least reliable thing in a room. She glanced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the circular driveway. Beyond the rain-streaked glass sat a line of black luxury SUVs waiting to transport Vincent Moretti to an important charity event downtown. Nothing unusual about that. The unusual part was who kept checking the time. One bodyguard looked at his watch, then another, then a third. Danielle frowned slightly. Most people never notice patterns. She did. That was why she always paid attention when a pattern suddenly changed. 20 minutes later, while carrying fresh towels toward the staff corridor, she heard voices drifting through a partially open maintenance room door. The voices immediately stopped when footsteps approached. Danielle kept walking without hesitation. She never turned her head, never slowed down, never gave any indication she had heard anything. But she had caught enough. A location, a time, and one sentence that refused to leave her mind. By itself, the sentence meant nothing. Combined with everything else she had noticed that week, it meant far too much. The rest of the afternoon became a blur of uneasy observations. A security badge left where it should not have been. A schedule printed twice instead of once. A phone conversation that ended abruptly when someone noticed her nearby. Each detail seemed insignificant. Yet together they formed something larger. Something she could almost see but not fully understand. As evening approached, the estate transformed into organized motion. Staff lined the hallways. Security teams moved into position. Vincent Moretti prepared to leave. Danielle stood quietly near the service entrance, her heart beating faster than usual. She told herself she might be wrong. She hoped she was wrong, because if she was right, the consequences would reach far beyond an embarrassing misunderstanding. Across the foyer, Vincent descended the grand staircase. At 46, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His tailored black suit fit perfectly. His expression remained calm and controlled. Around him moved a team of bodyguards who had protected him for years. Men he trusted. Men who knew his routines, his schedule, and his habits better than almost anyone. Danielle watched them carefully. Then she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. One guard exchanged a brief glance with another. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed. Danielle did. And for some reason, that glance felt wrong. Vincent approached the front entrance. Rain hammered against the glass doors. The lead vehicle waited outside with its engine running. Staff members stepped aside respectfully. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Danielle realized she had only seconds left to decide. Walk away and say nothing. Or risk everything by speaking. Her position, her reputation, her future. She moved before fear could stop her. Crossing the foyer, she approached Vincent just as he reached for the door. One of the bodyguards immediately stepped forward. Danielle lowered her voice. "Mr. Moretti." Vincent paused, surprised that she had interrupted him. Danielle could feel several pairs of eyes turning toward her. The bodyguards looked irritated. The staff looked confused. But none of that mattered now. She stepped closer and spoke so quietly that only Vincent could hear. "Leave through the back door." His eyes narrowed. "What?" Danielle swallowed hard. Every instinct told her this was a terrible idea. Yet something stronger pushed her forward. She looked directly at him. "Because your bodyguards are waiting for you to use the front one." For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. Rain struck the windows. Engines idled outside. The foyer fell silent. Vincent stared at her as though she had just spoken another language. Danielle could see disbelief forming in his eyes. She could also see something else. Curiosity. And as the bodyguards began moving closer, Danielle suddenly realized she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The only question now was whether Vincent Moretti would dismiss her as a frightened maid who imagined danger where none existed, or whether he would ask the question that might change everything. Vincent Moretti did not move. The foyer remained frozen around him as rain continued striking the tall glass doors. Danielle could feel the weight of every stare in the room. One housekeeper lowered her eyes. A driver exchanged a confused glance with another employee. The bodyguards looked annoyed, as though an invisible line had been crossed. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Vincent calmly removed his hand from the door handle and turned toward her. "Come with me." The word surprised everyone, especially Danielle. Instead of dismissing her, he led her away from the entrance and into a private study overlooking the estate grounds. The moment the door closed behind them, the noise of the household disappeared. Warm light from antique lamps reflected across dark wood shelves lined with books. Vincent stood beside the desk and studied her carefully. "Explain." Danielle swallowed. Suddenly, the confidence that had carried her across the foyer began to fade. She was not a security expert. She had no evidence, no recordings, no documents, only observations. "I know how this sounds," she said quietly. "Then tell me anyway." Vincent folded his arms. Danielle took a breath. "For the past week, things have felt wrong." His expression remained unreadable. "Wrong how?" Danielle searched for the right words. "Small things. Things most people would ignore." Vincent remained silent, waiting. A schedule appeared somewhere it should not have been. Security staff have been acting differently. Conversations stop when certain people walk into rooms. And today I overheard something. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly. "What did you hear?" Danielle hesitated. The truth sounded weak when spoken aloud. Not enough to prove anything. A faint shadow of disappointment crossed Vincent's face. Danielle noticed immediately. "I know." She looked down. "That is why I almost said nothing." The room fell quiet. Outside the window, rain rolled down the glass in silver streams. Vincent walked toward the fireplace and stared into the flames. For years, people had approached him with information. Some sought favor. Others wanted money. Many wanted attention. Danielle had never asked him for anything. In fact, she rarely spoke to him at all. That fact alone made the situation difficult to dismiss. "Why risk your job?" he finally asked. Danielle looked surprised. "What? You understand what happens if you are wrong?" She nodded. "Yes." "Then why say anything?" The answer came immediately. "Because if I am right and stay silent, I would never forgive myself." Vincent turned slowly toward her. The sincerity in her voice was impossible to miss. There was no ambition there, no manipulation, only concern. Yet concern alone was not enough. "Do you know who you are accusing?" he asked. Danielle looked toward the closed door. "No. Those men have worked for me for years." "I know. Some longer than you have worked here." Danielle nodded again. "I know that too." Vincent studied her face. What troubled him most was not what she was saying. It was how certain she seemed despite having so little proof. Then a sudden thought crossed his mind. "Who else have you told?" Danielle shook her head immediately. "Nobody." "Not another employee?" "No." "Not your friends?" "No." Vincent walked back to the desk and stared at the rain-covered estate. If there truly was nothing to this, the matter would disappear quickly. But if there was even a small chance she was right, ignoring her could be a mistake. Behind him, Danielle waited silently. Then Vincent asked a question neither of them expected. "If you were me," he said quietly, "what would you do next?" Danielle looked toward the window, where black SUVs still waited in the storm. And for the first time that evening, she realized he might actually be listening. Danielle looked out at the rain-covered driveway before answering. The black SUVs remained parked beneath the estate lights, their polished surfaces reflecting streaks of silver water. Everything looked normal. That was the problem. "I would change something small," she said quietly. Vincent watched her. "Small?" She nodded. "Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough to see who reacts." Vincent remained silent. Danielle continued carefully. "If someone is paying attention to your plans, they can only respond to information they receive. Change the information and watch what changes with it." The room fell quiet again. Vincent had spent years surrounded by security professionals, consultants, and advisors. Yet the woman standing in front of him was describing something remarkably simple. "Test the pattern. See if the pattern moves." He walked toward the desk and glanced at the schedule prepared for the evening. According to the plan, he would attend a charity dinner downtown before returning to the estate shortly after midnight. Hundreds of people expected him there. Reporters would be waiting. Sponsors would be waiting. Everything had already been arranged. Then an idea formed. He picked up his phone and sent a brief message. Only 3 people would receive it. The message stated that he would not be attending the dinner after all. Instead, He would be traveling to a private meeting at a hotel nearly 30 miles away. The information was completely false. Vincent placed the phone down and looked at Danielle. Now we wait. Danielle felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Waiting was the hardest part. Because once a suspicion entered your mind, every minute felt longer than it should. An hour later, the estate seemed unchanged. Staff members continued working. Rain continued falling. The bodyguards remained at their posts. Danielle almost began convincing herself she had imagined everything. Then she noticed something. One of the guards she had seen earlier suddenly left his position and stepped outside beneath a covered walkway. He pulled out his phone and began speaking. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When he returned, his expression looked perfectly normal. Yet something about the timing felt wrong. Danielle said nothing. She simply watched. Later that evening, Vincent received a call from a business associate. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, he stared at the screen without speaking. Danielle happened to be nearby when he emerged from the study. What happened? She asked cautiously. Vincent looked at her. For the first time, there was no dismissal in his eyes. Only concern. Someone asked me why I changed hotels. Danielle felt her pulse quicken. Hotels. Vincent nodded. The meeting location from the message. Silence settled between them. Only 3 people had received that information. 3. Yet somehow someone outside that circle already knew about it. Danielle suddenly understood why Vincent looked troubled. The problem was no longer whether her suspicions were real. The problem was that they were becoming harder to ignore. Vincent walked toward the window, overlooking the dark grounds. Rain continued falling beyond the glass. Somewhere inside the estate, answers existed. Somewhere nearby, someone knew more than they should. And as Danielle watched the reflection of the room shimmer across the window, she realized that the pattern had finally moved. The question now was not whether information was leaking. The question was who had opened the door. The following morning, the storm had finally passed, but the atmosphere inside the Moretti estate felt heavier than ever. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating polished floors and expensive artwork, yet none of it seemed capable of lifting the tension hanging over the house. Vincent had slept very little. The phone call from the previous evening kept replaying in his mind. Only 3 people had received the false information. Somehow that information had escaped almost immediately. The conclusion was impossible to avoid. Someone close to him was talking. The question was who? Shortly after breakfast, Vincent called a private meeting in his study. 3 senior members of his security team entered the room one by one. Danielle was not present. She remained downstairs helping prepare lunch service, though she could not stop thinking about what might happen next. For the first time, since she had arrived at the estate 2 years earlier, she felt as though she had stepped into a world she was never meant to see. Upstairs, Vincent watched each man carefully. One had worked for him for 12 years. Another for nearly 8. The third was his chief of security, a man named Robert Hayes who had accompanied him through countless business trips and public appearances. If betrayal existed inside his circle, it was hiding behind years of trust. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. Questions were asked. Explanations were given. Nobody appeared nervous. Nobody contradicted themselves. When it was over, Vincent felt more uncertain than before. Later that afternoon, Danielle was arranging books in the estate library when she noticed something unusual. Robert Hayes walked through the corridor carrying a file folder. Nothing strange about that, except he entered a room he never used. The old West Wing office had remained mostly empty for months. Danielle watched from a distance as the door closed behind him. 10 minutes later, he emerged without the folder. Her curiosity immediately awakened. She waited until the hallway was empty before approaching the room. The door stood slightly open. Inside, everything appeared normal. A desk, several chairs, dusty shelves. Then her eyes settled on a wastebasket near the corner. Resting inside was a torn piece of paper. Danielle picked it up carefully. Most of the document was missing. Only a small section remained. Yet one detail instantly caught her attention. It contained a partial schedule. Vincent's schedule. Her pulse quickened. Why would a security officer destroy part of a schedule inside an abandoned office instead of using the secure disposal bins located throughout the estate? Danielle folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. That evening, she quietly brought it to Vincent. He examined the fragment beneath the soft light of his desk lamp. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Vincent looked up. Where did you find this? Danielle explained everything. Vincent listened carefully. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. This still proves nothing. Danielle nodded. I know. Yet both of them understood something important had changed. The evidence remained incomplete. The mystery remained unsolved. But for the second time, the trail had pointed in the same direction. Vincent stared at the torn schedule fragment resting on his desk. Outside his office window, the sun disappeared behind the horizon. Shadows stretched across the estate grounds. And somewhere inside the house, a person he trusted was becoming increasingly nervous without realizing that someone invisible had begun noticing every move they made. For the next 2 days, Vincent said very little about the investigation. To everyone else, life at the estate appeared completely normal. Meetings continued. Staff followed their routines. Security personnel remained at their assigned posts. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had changed. Vincent had begun watching. Not openly, not dramatically, quietly, the same way Danielle watched. Late on the second evening, he invited Danielle into the study once again. A storm of orange sunset light filled the room, stretching long shadows across the polished floor. On the desk rested a single sheet of paper. Vincent looked at her. You said small changes reveal patterns. Danielle nodded. Sometimes. Vincent slid the paper toward her. It contained a travel schedule. According to the document, he would be leaving Chicago for 3 days to attend a private business retreat in Colorado. The information looked authentic. Flight numbers, hotel reservations, meeting times. Everything appeared legitimate. Danielle studied it for a moment. Then she looked up. It is fake. Vincent allowed himself a faint smile. Completely. Danielle immediately understood. You are creating another test. Vincent nodded. This time only 4 people will know. The realization made her stomach tighten. Every test narrowed the circle. Every test brought them closer to someone who might not want to be discovered. The next morning, the new schedule was quietly distributed to 4 trusted individuals. No announcements were made. No discussions took place. Then everyone waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. By evening, Danielle began wondering whether this attempt would fail. Then, shortly after dinner, she noticed something unusual. One of the estate assistants was speaking nervously on the phone near the courtyard. As soon as Robert Hayes appeared nearby, the assistant immediately ended the call. The interaction lasted only seconds. Most people would have ignored it. Danielle did not. Later that night, Vincent received another unexpected message. This time it came from a business contact in Denver. The man wanted to confirm details regarding the supposed Colorado retreat. Vincent stared at the screen for a long time before placing the phone down. The fake schedule had traveled nearly 1,000 miles in less than 12 hours. The leak was real. There was no longer any reasonable doubt. Danielle was helping prepare coffee service when Vincent entered the kitchen unexpectedly. He rarely came there himself. The moment their eyes met, she knew something had happened. Vincent spoke quietly. The information surfaced again. Danielle set down the tray she was holding. Then someone shared it. Vincent nodded. Neither smiled. Neither celebrated being correct. Because being right about betrayal never felt like a victory. It felt like discovering a crack in the foundation of a house you trusted. Vincent looked through the nearby window toward the security office across the courtyard. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression. Not fear. Disappointment. The people under suspicion were not strangers. They were individuals who had stood beside him for years. Danielle followed his gaze. What happens now? She asked softly. Vincent remained silent for several moments. Then he answered. Now we stop asking whether there is a leak. He looked toward the darkening estate grounds where evening shadows slowly gathered. And we start finding out who opened it. Neither of them noticed that from a second-floor window across the courtyard, someone was watching the security office as closely as they were. The breakthrough came on a quiet Thursday afternoon when nobody expected it. The estate was unusually calm. Most of the senior staff were occupied preparing for an upcoming charity fundraiser, and several security personnel had been reassigned to event planning duties. Danielle spent the afternoon organizing storage shelves near the service wing when Vincent appeared in the doorway. His expression immediately told her something had changed. Walk with me, he said. They crossed the estate grounds toward a small guest house located near the far edge of the property. The building was rarely used except for private meetings. Once inside, Vincent closed the door and placed a folder on the table between them. I found something this morning. Danielle opened the folder. Inside were communication logs, visitor records, and security reports. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Then she noticed several highlighted entries. Every leak had one thing in common. Each piece of false information had passed through a very specific chain of people before appearing elsewhere. Danielle studied the names carefully. 3 names appeared repeatedly. One of them stood out more than the others. Robert Hayes, the chief of security. Danielle slowly looked up. This cannot be a coincidence anymore. Vincent nodded. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. I have spent 12 years trusting him. Danielle returned her attention to the documents. Maybe there is another explanation. Vincent almost smiled. You still want to give people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes people deserve that chance. Vincent looked through the window toward the main estate. And sometimes they do not. The room fell silent. After a few moments, Danielle pointed toward one particular report. What is this? Vincent moved closer. The document showed access records for secure schedule files. Several entries had been made late at night. Most belonged to authorized personnel. One did not. The access occurred only minutes before confidential information surfaced elsewhere. Danielle followed the timeline carefully. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every trail eventually curved back toward the same person. Yet something continued bothering her. If Robert is involved, she said quietly, why stay? Vincent frowned. What do you mean? Danielle folded her hands. If someone wanted to betray your trust, why? Remain close enough to be discovered. Vincent considered the question. The answer arrived slowly. Access, influence, information. The closer someone remained, the more valuable they became. Danielle noticed his expression change. He had reached the same conclusion. The leak was not random. It was systematic, deliberate, patient. Suddenly, a soft knock interrupted the conversation. One of Vincent's assistants entered carrying a tablet. Sir, you asked to be notified if anything unusual happened. Vincent accepted the device. His eyes moved across the screen. Then he became very still. Danielle immediately sensed something important. What is it? Vincent handed her the tablet. An anonymous source had just requested confirmation regarding another private trip. A trip that did not exist. More importantly, the false information had only been shared with one person that morning. One person, Robert Hayes. The room became completely silent. Neither spoke for several seconds. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower across the estate grounds. Long shadows stretched across the grass. For days they had been following clues, watching patterns, testing theories. Now, for the first time, the mystery was beginning to narrow into a single name. Yet Danielle could not shake the feeling that the most difficult part of the story had not begun. Because discovering who had broken trust was one thing. Learning why they had done it might prove far more painful. The next morning arrived with an uncomfortable sense of certainty. For nearly a week, Vincent had hoped every new clue would point somewhere else. A misunderstanding, a procedural mistake, an innocent explanation hiding beneath suspicious circumstances. But hope became harder to defend with every piece of evidence. Shortly after sunrise, he sat alone in his study reviewing the communication records one final time. The conclusion remained unchanged. Every path led back to Robert Hayes. The man had protected him for more than a decade. The man who knew his routines, his travel plans, and the names of the people he trusted most. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Danielle entered carrying a tray of coffee. The moment she saw his expression, she knew something important had happened. Vincent looked up from the documents. I asked an outside firm to review everything independently. Danielle quietly placed the tray on the desk. And Vincent exhaled slowly. They reached the same conclusion we did. The room fell silent. Neither seemed pleased by being right. Danielle looked toward the window. What will you do? Vincent stared at the file. First, I need to understand why. That afternoon, he arranged a private meeting with Robert inside the guest house near the edge of the property. No security team, no assistants, no witnesses, only a conversation. Danielle remained in the main estate, but she could not concentrate on her work. Every clock seemed louder than usual. Every minute stretched endlessly. Hours later, Vincent returned. He walked through the front door more slowly than normal. Not angry, not shocked, simply tired. Danielle found him standing alone in the library. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating rows of books and casting long shadows across the floor. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Danielle asked the question she had been carrying all day. Was it him? Vincent nodded. The answer landed heavily between them. Danielle lowered her eyes. Somehow hearing it felt worse than suspecting it. Vincent walked toward a bookshelf and rested one hand against the polished wood. Do you know what surprised me most? Danielle shook her head. It was not money. She looked up. Vincent gave a sad smile. Everyone assumes betrayal starts with greed. Sometimes it starts with disappointment. Slowly, the story emerged. Robert had spent years believing his loyalty entitled him to influence. When certain business decisions excluded him, resentment quietly replaced respect. Small frustrations grew into larger ones. Eventually, he began sharing information with people outside Vincent's circle, convincing himself it was harmless. Then the behavior became a habit. Danielle listened carefully. The explanation was painful because it sounded human. Not the actions, the emotions behind them. Vincent stared out the window toward the estate grounds. The strange thing is that I still remember the day I hired him. His voice softened. I trusted him completely. Danielle remained silent. Some losses could not be improved by advice. Vincent turned toward her. You saw it before anyone else. Danielle looked uncomfortable. I only noticed things. Vincent shook his head. No. You paid attention when everyone else stopped paying attention. The room became quiet again. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the lawn in the afternoon breeze. And for the first time since this mystery began, the question of who had broken trust was finally answered. Yet another question remained. After discovering the truth, what kind of man would Vincent Moretti choose to become next? The days that followed surprised everyone. Rumors spread quickly through the estate that major changes were coming, yet Vincent refused to allow anger to guide his decisions. The investigation was completed quietly. Responsibilities were reassigned. Security procedures were reviewed. Life moved forward. To most people, the situation appeared resolved. Danielle knew it was not that simple. Trust, once damaged, did not repair itself overnight. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the truth had come to light, Vincent asked Danielle to join him on the rear terrace overlooking the gardens. Autumn had painted the estate in shades of gold and copper. The fountains reflected the fading sunlight, and a cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the grounds. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply watched the sunset settle over the property. Finally, Vincent broke the silence. There is something I never asked you. Danielle looked at him. What is that? He leaned against the stone railing. How did you know? Danielle smiled faintly. I did not. Vincent raised an eyebrow. You seemed very certain. She shook her head. I was not certain. I was paying attention. The answer caught him off guard. Danielle looked toward the gardens below. Most people think observation is about seeing more. It is not. It is about noticing what changes. Vincent listened carefully. When people are honest, their patterns stay consistent. When something is wrong, the pattern shifts. The words lingered between them. Then Vincent asked another question. Where did you learn that? Danielle was quiet for a moment. A small smile appeared on her face. My father. Vincent turned toward her. It was the first time she had ever spoken about her family. What did he do? Private investigator. Vincent nodded slowly. Suddenly many things made sense. Danielle continued. When I was young, he used to tell me something every morning before school. She laughed softly. At the time, I thought it was annoying. What did he say? Danielle looked toward the horizon where the last sunlight glowed beyond the trees. People lie. Patterns do not. Vincent repeated the words silently. People lie. Patterns do not. The simplicity of the statement made it powerful. Danielle folded her hands. He taught me to pay attention to details most people ignore. Not because I should distrust everyone. Because understanding people requires listening to what they do, not only what they say. For several seconds, Vincent said nothing. Then he realized something. The entire investigation had succeeded because of a lesson passed from one generation to another. A lesson carried quietly by a woman whom almost nobody considered important. He looked at Danielle differently now. Not as an employee, not as someone working in the background, as a person whose judgment had protected everyone around her. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the estate wrapped in soft evening light. Vincent glanced toward the main house where preparations were underway for an important gathering scheduled later that week. Business leaders, community figures, and trusted associates would all be present. Then he looked back at Danielle. There is something else that needs to change. Danielle frowned slightly. What? Vincent smiled for the first time in days. Where you stand in this house. Danielle did not yet understand what he meant. But before the week was over, the entire estate would. The night of the fundraiser arrived beneath a sky filled with clear autumn stars. The Moretti estate glowed with warm light as guests moved through the grand halls dressed in formal attire. Business leaders, community organizers, local officials, and longtime associates filled the ballroom with conversation and laughter. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the far wall. To anyone entering the room, the evening appeared flawless. Yet Vincent Moretti knew this gathering represented more than another successful event. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Danielle spent most of the evening doing what she always did. She worked quietly. She helped coordinate service. She made certain guests were comfortable. She moved through the room almost unnoticed, just as she had done since arriving at the estate. Old habits were difficult to break. Shortly before the evening program began, she stepped toward the rear of the ballroom, intending to remain out of sight. Then Vincent approached the podium positioned beneath the largest chandelier in the room. Gradually, conversations faded. Glasses were lowered. Attention shifted toward the front of the room. Vincent thanked the guests for attending. He spoke about community projects, charitable initiatives, and future plans. Everything sounded routine. Then his expression changed slightly. Before we conclude tonight, he said, there is someone I would like to recognize. Danielle barely looked up. She assumed he was referring to a business partner or donor. Vincent glanced across the ballroom. Danielle Brooks. The room became silent. Danielle froze. Dozens of heads turned toward her. Confusion spread across the faces of guests and staff alike. For a moment, she genuinely believed she had heard him incorrectly. Vincent smiled. Would you please join me? Danielle's heart pounded as she slowly crossed the ballroom. Every step felt longer than the last. When she reached the front, she stopped beside the podium, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Vincent waited until the room settled again. Then he spoke. Several weeks ago, someone noticed something the rest of us missed. His voice remained calm and steady. She saw patterns others ignored. She asked difficult questions when remaining silent would have been easier. And because she chose courage over comfort, she protected people who never realized they needed protection. The ballroom remained completely still. Danielle lowered her eyes. Vincent continued. Too often we judge value by titles, by positions, by visibility. We assume the most important person is the loudest person in the room. He paused briefly. Sometimes the most important person is the one quietly paying attention while everyone else is distracted. Several guests nodded. Others exchanged thoughtful glances. Vincent turned toward Danielle. You reminded me of something I should have learned years ago. Respect is not earned through status. It is earned through character. Then he reached beside the podium and lifted a folder. Beginning tonight, Danielle Brooks will serve as special advisor for estate operations and internal security review. A wave of surprise moved through the room. Danielle looked up in disbelief. Vincent smiled. Because if I am fortunate enough to have someone capable of seeing what others miss, I would be a fool not to listen. Soft applause began near the front of the ballroom. Then more guests joined. Then more. Within seconds, the entire room was standing. The applause filled the hall beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Danielle stood speechless as people who had barely noticed her existence only weeks earlier now looked at her with genuine respect. Across the room, several staff members wiped tears from their eyes. Vincent stepped back and allowed the moment to belong entirely to her. For years, Danielle had worked in the background, unseen by most and underestimated by many. Yet in the end, it was not power, wealth, or influence that earned the room's admiration. It was integrity. And as the applause continued beneath the warm lights of the ballroom, everyone present witnessed something far more meaningful than recognition. They witnessed dignity receiving the place it had always deserved.